Synopsis. In August 1882, 5 members of the Joyce family were found brutally murdered in their cottage in the remote mountainous townland of Maamtrasna in the west of Ireland. No motive has ever been clearly established. 2 men in the house were shot dead and 3 women violently beaten to death. The youngest child miraculously survived the attack despite his wounds. And his brother, who was working in the nearby village at the time, was the only other surviving family member. 10 local men were charged with the quintuple murder. The 2 with the best English abilities became informers during the trial, testified against the other accused and escaped conviction. 3 were sentenced to death and hanged. And the remaining 5 pleaded guilty on advice of their priest and were sentenced to life in prison. None of the accused were native English speakers. And the trial was held entirely English with an English-speaking jury. Only the judge's questions directed to the accused, and the answers, were translated into Irish. In 2018, the President of Ireland pardoned one of the men who had been hanged. Moalra Shoga, a father of 5. This is the first and only presidential pardon that relates to events before the foundation of the state. Despite the fallout from the scandalous trial reaching international news and contributing to the collapse of Gladstone's government, the British authorities have never held any inquiry or issued any apology. #Amp. #X200B. Full story. Background. Maamtrasna is a small village that sits on the western shores of Loch Mask at the foot of the Partry Mountains in remote region of Ireland called Connemara. The name loosely translates as «mountain pass» in English. In the 1800s, the Irish language was widespread across everywhere in Ireland except Dublin City. Though in modern times Connemara is one of the few remaining places where Irish is still spoken as a first language due to its remoteness. Some small patches of land are barren and rocky, but the majority of the landscape is boggy with low vegetation and dominated by mountain ranges, such as the 12 Bens and Maumturks. Narrow roads wind between mountains and lakes for some scenic driving. The region has famously poor farmland and most of the mountains are designated as commonage, with the local farmers leaving their livestock to roam freely and graze off the land. A way of life dating back thousands of years. The 1880s was a time of political unrest in Ireland. Catholics had only gained the right to vote in 1829 and the country was deeply scarred from the Great Famine of the 1840s and was seeing a greater push for independence against British rule. A violent fight between the aristocracy and peasant farmers over ownership of the land they worked, called the Land War, was at its height in 1882. For convenience, places and names will be translated to English, though the crimes occurred in an Irish-speaking region. All of the accused spoke the Irish language as their native tongue. And the region is still Irish-speaking in modern times. #Amp. #X200B. The murders. There was 7 members of the family in total. John Joyce, his second wife Bridget, his mother-in-law Margaret, their daughter Peggy, and 3 sons Martin, Michael, and Patsy. The cottage was typical for tenant farmers of the time. Whitewashed limestone walls with a thatched roof and only 2 rooms the front door opened in. The main room, which contained the dinner table and an open fire. The inner room was primarily a bedroom. During the attack only 6 were present in the house as the oldest son Martin was working in a nearby village called Clonba 15 kilometers away. In the middle of the night on 18 August 1882, a local farmer called John Collins heard an awful disturbance and decided to investigate the Joyces' cottage with 2 other neighbors. Mary and Margaret O'Brien. The front door had been smashed, and inside lay the naked body of John Joyce, shot twice in the chest. His wife Bridget lay beside him, her skull crushed from blunt force trauma. Nearby their son Michael was also shot twice but barely alive. In the other room, the mother Margaret was naked with a horrific wound in her forehead. The daughter Peggy also beaten to death. The youngest son Patsy had severe head injuries but was miraculously still alive. He would become the only survivor of the attack after 3 p.m. the following day when his brother Michael succumbs to his wounds. The initial investigation was carried out by local magistrate Newton Brady, Rick Constable Johnston, both of whom only spoke English, and Sub-Constable Lenihan, who was bilingual, and translated. When questioned just after the attack, the orphaned boys described a group of 3 or 4 men with blackened faces that had forced their way into the tiny cottage. Between a mixture of fear and animosity, none of the locals offered any assistance to surviving Joyces after the attack. And Damp #X200B. Motive. The motive for the attack has never been properly established due to corruption amongst officials, improper investigation, and a wall of silence within the local community. Nevertheless, a number of theories have been put forward, such as 1. The Joyce family had been targeted because the teenage daughter Peggy had an inappropriate relationship with a member of the Royal Irish Constabulary. The RIC were the police force maintaining British rule at the time, and a relationship with a peasant farmer girl would have been highly scandalous. 2. Another theory is the attack was perpetrated by locals in the community with the mother Margaret as primary target because she had informed the authorities about the location in Loch Marske where the bodies of the landlord's employees were dumped. 3. In 2017, TG4 released a documentary called Murder Maamtrasna, where the surviving grandchild of John Joyce explained that the family had been generally quite unpopular within the local community, and that an influential member of the community called Big John Casey had convinced a gang of men to attack the family over suspicions that the Joyces had been regularly stealing his sheep, something that would have been very difficult to prevent in the commonage system. 4. In any case, the official motive postulated by the police was that John Joyce was a member of a secret militia called the Ribbonmen, a group of Catholic tenant farmers that had organised against the Protestant aristocracy in Ireland. They often attacked and killed employees, enabling the exploitive landlords. And it was alleged the Joyce family was targeted because they had misappropriated funds belonging to the organization. Despite the range of possible motives, it's difficult to marry any of them with the severity of the crimes, especially given the extra brutality used against the women of the house. And Damp #X200B. Arrest and trial. Immediately after the attack, the primary suspect was Big John Casey, due to a well-known feud between him and the deceased John Joyce. The RIC had quickly arrested him, though he was released shortly after a number of witnesses from the local area gave statements accusing a number of others. It would later transpire that the first 2 witnesses who came forward each received a reward of £500. And the third witness received a reward of £250 from the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who served as Viceroy to Queen Victoria as well as head of the executive government in Ireland. In the end, 10 men from the local area were charged with the quintuple homicide. Pat, Michael, and Little John Casey from Maamtrasna village, as well as the following men from various other villages in the vicinity: Miles Joyce, his brothers Martin and Paudine, and nephew Tom, Pat Joyce, Tom Casey, and Anthony Philbin. The men were remanded in custody in a prison in Dublin and assigned a solicitor. Henry Concannon, Mr. Concannon, a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, was only 24 at the time of trial, did not speak any Irish, and had not been permitted to interview his clients before proceedings began. Before trial, Anthony Philbin and his brother-in-law Tom Casey, who had previously lived in Northamptonshire in England and had the best English language abilities, struck a deal with the prosecution counsel for charges to be dropped if they testified in court against their co-accused. The remaining men stood trial in Dublin's Green Street Courthouse. Each of the men were to be tried separately. Patrick Joyce was first before the courts, followed by Patrick Casey, Miles Joyce's, etc. The jury consisted of 12 upper-class men and women from Dublin City, all whom only spoke English and would have been exceptionally wealthy in comparison to farmers from the west of Ireland. No proper interpreter was provided, and a policeman serving as a security guard was asked to translate despite an objection that he spoke a different dialect of Irish of the accused. Translations were only provided for questions directed directly at the accused, with the bulk of evidence and discourse remaining inaccessible. Before testifying, the only surviving victim of the attack took the stand and was questioned by the prosecution counsel. It was determined that the young boy did not understand the consequences of lying, and was excused from giving evidence by the judge. As a result, the jury and defense counsel would never find out that the perpetrators had blackened their faces to conceal their identities. Given the testimonies of 3 eyewitnesses, who all identified the accused, as well as the testimonies from the 2 informers who had sufficient English to address the court without a translator, the jury were given very little to doubt the prosecution's theory and took only 8 minutes to deliberate before finding Pat Joyce guilty. His entire trial and sentencing was over by lunchtime. Pat Casey's trial began immediately after and took a virtually identical course, with the prosecution submitting the same statements and testimonies. This time deliberations lasted 12 minutes before the unanimous guilty verdict. The third trial began before the day was finished, and early the next day the jury found Miles Joyce guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to be hanged. Spooked by the course of the proceedings, and on advice from their solicitor Mr. Concannon and their local priest, the remaining 5 men decided to plead guilty and were spared their life, all being sentenced to life in prison. And Amp. X200B. Aftermath. The 3 men sentenced to be hanged were transferred to Galway prison. While awaiting execution, Pat Joyce and Pat Casey separately confessed that were involved in the murders and attempted to exonerate Miles Joyce. 2 days before the hanging, Pat Joyce disposed to a priest that he was involved in the murder and named a number of accomplices. In addition to himself, he named Pat Casey, Michael Casey, and Tom Casey from the accused as partaking in the murders, with Tom Casey as the sole shooter making use of 3 different firearms. He cleared all other accused men as having absolutely knowledge or no part in the events. He claimed the motive for the attack was simply spite. Unfortunately, these statements, which were sent to the Lord Lieutenant, were unsuccessful in helping Miles Joyce. The night before the hanging, the Lord Lieutenant wrote back saying, "The law must take its course." On 15 December 1882, the Miles Joyce, Pat Joyce, and Pat Casey were hanged in the yard of the prison. Miles Joyce's last words were, "And gt. Fic fi me isa kriastar bol biog, croha isian san agua chove myth. Ara. Ta me agamayact. Go bois dir amo bean agus akugir diliacti. And GT reported his hanging was botched and Miles Joyce wreathed for several minutes until he suffocated. He left behind 4 kids and a pregnant wife. Today Galway Cathedral sits on the site of the former prison. It was opened in 1965 and the location of gallows is marked in the cathedral car park. Of the 5 men sentenced to life in prison, Michael and Little John Casey died in custody. The wives of remaining 3 men, Martin, Paudine Joyce, appealed to Lord Dudley, the Queen's deputy, when he visited Connemara in 1902, and the men were eventually released on 24 September 1902. After 20 years in prison, they got a train from Dublin to Ballinrobe and had to walk the final 29 kilometres home. Despite being promised monetary compensation, the 2 accused turned informers were never given a penny, though they did attain their freedom and returned to Maamtrasna, where they were ostracised from the community. In 1884, seeking redemption in the eyes of God, Tom Casey walked up to the altar of a nearby church during a confirmation mass and confessed to the Archbishop John McEvilley that he had given false testimony under oath. Policemen who happened to be attendants sent reports of the confession to Dublin. While failing to overturn the convictions, the reports did spark a media frenzy that reached the British Parliament in Westminster. The fallout eventually caused a number of Irish MPs led by Charles Stewart Parnell to join a movement for a vote of no confidence which successfully took down William Gladstone's government in 1885. The London-based newspaper The Spectator had this to say on the matter. And AMP #X200B and GT, the tragedy at Maamtrasna, investigated this week in Dublin, almost unique as it is in the annals of the United Kingdom, brings out in strong relief 2 facts which Englishmen are too apt to forget. One is the existence in particular districts of Ireland of a class of peasants who are scarcely civilized beings, and approach far nearer to savages than any other white men. And the other is their extraordinary and exceptional gloominess of temper in remote places of Ireland, especially in Connaught, on a few of the islands, and in 1 or 2 mountain districts, dwell cultivators who are in knowledge, in habits, and in the discipline of life no higher than Maoris or other Polynesians. And AMP #X200B. Conclusion. So while the trial has been largely discredited and debunked as merely political, the mystery remains. Who murdered the Joyce family? And what motive could have driven someone to commit quintuple homicide? Who was involved in cover-up and what was their motives? And AMP #X200B. Guide to persons involved. Victim family. John Joyce, father. Bridget Joyce, John's second wife. Margaret, John's mother. Martin, son. Survived. Michael, son. 17. Peggy, daughter. Patsy, youngest son. 12. Survived. Accused. Miles Joyce, unrelated local man, father of 5, hanged. Pat Joyce, unrelated to other Joyces, confessed after conviction, hanged. Pat Casey, confessed after conviction, hanged. Anthony Philbin, turned informer. Tom Casey, turned informer, brother-in-law of Philbin, unrelated to the other Caseys. Martin Joyce, brother of Miles. Paudine Joyce, brother of Miles. Tom Joyce, nephew of Miles. Little John Casey. Michael Casey, guilty, as confessed by Pat Joyce. Pat Joyce. Pat Casey. Michael Casey. Tom Casey, shooter. 3 other men, not charged. Big John Casey, coordinated the attack but not present on the day. And AMP X200B. Links. Sources. And AMP X200B. TG4 documentary. 2-minute trailer. Full length.